Section 5 of the Ingoldsby Legends, First Series. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ingoldsby Legends, First Series by Richard Harris Bowram. Section 5. One marvel follows another as naturally as one shoulder of mutton is said to drive another down. A little Welsh girl, who sometimes makes her way from the kitchen into the nursery, after listening with intense interest to this tale, immediately started off at score with the sum and substance of what, in due reverence for such authority, I shall call Patty Morgan, the Milkmaid's Story. Look at the Clock. Fit 1. Look at the clock, quoth Winifred Pryce, as she opened the door to her husband's knock, then paused to give him a piece of advice. You nasty warmint, look at the clock. Is this the way, you wretch, every day you treat her who vowed to love and obey you? Out all night, me in a fright, staggering home as it's just getting light? You intoxified brute, you insensible block, look at the clock, do, look at the clock. Winifred Pryce was tidy and clean, her gown was a flowered one, her petticoat green, her buckles were bright as her milking cans, and her hat was a beaver, and made like a man's. Her little red eyes were deep set in their socket holes, her gown tail was turned up and tucked through the pocket holes. A face like a ferret betokened her spirit. To conclude, Mrs. Pryce was not over young, had very short legs, and a very long tongue. Now David Pryce had one darling vice, remarkably partial to anything nice. Naught that was good to him came amiss, whether to eat, or to drink, or to kiss. Especially ale, if it was not too stale, I really believe he'd have emptied a pail. Not that in Wales they talk of their ales, to pronounce the word they make use of might trouble you, being spelt with a C, 2 R's, and a W. That particular day, as I've heard people say, Mr. David Pryce had been soaking his clay, and amusing himself with his pipe and cheroots, the whole afternoon at the Goat in Boots, with a couple of soakers, thoroughbred smokers, both like himself, prime singers and jokers, and long after day had drawn to a close, and the rest of the world was wrapped in repose, they were roaring out Schenken and our Hiddy Nose, while David himself, to a Sassenach tune, sang, We've drunk down the sun, boys, let's drink down the moon. What have we with day to do? Mrs. Winifred Pryce, 'twas made for you. At length, when they couldn't well drink any more, old Goat in Boots showed them the door, and then came that knock, and the sensible shock David felt when his wife cried, Look at the clock, for the hands stood as crooked might be, the long at the 12, and the short at the 3. That self-same clock had long been a bone of contention between this Darby and Joan, and often among their pother and rout, when this otherwise amiable couple fell out, Pryce would drop a cool hint with an ominous squint at its case of an uncle of his who'd a spout. That horrid word spout no sooner came out than Winifred Pryce would turn her about, and with scorn on her lip and a hand on each hip, spout herself till her nose grew red at the tip. You thundering villain, I know you'd be killing your wife, aye, a dozen of wives, for a shilling. You may do what you please, you may sell my chemise. Mrs. P. was too well-bred to mention her stock, but I never will part with my grandmother's clock. Mrs. Pryce's tongue ran long and ran fast, but patience is apt to wear out at last, and David Pryce in temper was quick, so he stretched out his hand and caught hold of a stick. Perhaps in its use he might mean to be lenient, but walking just then wasn't very convenient, so he threw it instead direct at her head. It knocked off her hat, down she fell flat. Her case perhaps was not much mended by that, But whatever it was, whether rage and pain Produced apoplexy, or burst a vein, Or her tumble induced a concussion of brain, I can't say for certain, but this I can : When, sober'd by fright, to assist her he ran, Mrs. Winifred Pryce was as dead as Queen Anne. The fearful catastrophe, named in my last strophe, As adding to grim Death's exploits such a vast trophy, Made a great noise, and the shocking fatality Ran over like wildfire the whole principality. And then came Mr. Ap Thomas, the coroner, With his jury to sit, some dozen or more on her. Mr. Pryce, to commence his ingenious defence, Made a powerful appeal to the jury's good sense. The world he must defy ever to justify Any presumption of malice prepense. The unlucky lick from the end of his stick He deplored, he was apt to be rather too quick, But really her prating was so aggravating, Some trifling correction was just what he meant, all The rest, he assured them, was quite accidental. Then he calls Mr. Jones, who depones to her tones, And her gestures and hints about breaking his bones, While Mr. Ap Morgan and Mr. Ap Rees Declared the deceased had styled him a beast, And swear they had witnessed with grief and surprise The allusion she made to his limbs and his eyes. The jury, in fine, having sat on the body The whole day discussing the case and gin toddy, Returned about 11:30 at night. The following verdict we find, ' Sarve her right.' Mr. Pryce, Mrs. Winifred Pryce being dead, Felt lonely and moped, and one evening he said He would marry Miss Davis at once in her stead. Not far from his dwelling, from the vale proudly swelling, Rose a mountain, its name you'll excuse me from telling, For the vowels made use of in Welsh are so few, That the A and the E, the I-O and the U, Have really but little or nothing to do. And the duty, of course, falls the heavier by far On the L and the H and the N and the R. Its first syllable, pen, is pronounceable, then Come 2 L's and 2 H's, 2 F's and an N. About half a score R's and some W's follow, Beating all my best efforts at euphony hollow. But we shan't have to mention it often, so when We do, with your leave, we'll curtail it to pen. Well, the moon shone bright upon pen that night, When Pryce, being quit of his fuss and his fright, Was scaling its side with that sort of stride A man puts out when walking in search of a bride. Mounting higher and higher, he began to perspire, Till finding his legs were beginning to tire, And feeling oppressed by a pain in his chest, He paused and turned round to take breath and to rest. A walk all up hill is apt, we know, To make one, however robust, puff and blow. So he stopped and looked down on the valley below, O'er fell and o'er fen, over mountain and glen, All bright in the moonshine his eye roved, and then All the patriot rose in his soul, and he thought Upon Wales and her glories, and all he'd been taught Of her heroes of old, so brave and so bold, Of her bards with long beards, and harps mounted in gold, Of King Edward the First, of memory accursed, And the scandalous manner in which he behaved, Killing poets by dozens, with their uncles and cousins, Of whom not 1 in 50 had ever been shaved. Of the court ball at which, by a lucky mishap, Owen Tudor fell into Queen Catherine's lap, And how Mr. Tudor successfully wooed her, Till the Dowager put on a new wedding ring, And so made him father-in-law to the King. He thought upon Arthur and Merlin of yore, On Griffith ap Conan and Owen Glendour, On Pendragon, and heaven knows how many more. He thought of all this as he gazed in a trice, And on all things in short, but the late Mrs. Pryce, When a lumbering noise from behind made him start, and sent the blood back in full tide to his heart, which went pit-a-pat, and he cried out, " What's that? That very queer sound? Does it come from the ground, or the air, from above, or below, or around? It is not like talking, it is not like walking, it's not like the clattering of pot or of pan, or the tramp of a horse, or the tread of a man, or the hum of a crowd, or the shouting of boys. It's really a deuced odd sort of a noise, not unlike a cart's, but that can't be, for when could all the king's horses and all the king's men, with old Nick for a waggoner, drive one up Penn? Pryce, usually brimful of valour when drunk, now experienced what schoolboys denominate funk. In vain he looked back on the whole of the track he had traversed. A thick cloud uncommonly black at this moment obscured the broad disk of the moon, and did not seem likely to pass away soon, while clearer and clearer 'twas plain to the hearer, be the noise what it might, it drew nearer and nearer, and sounded, as Pryce to this moment declares, very much like a coffin a-walking upstairs. Mr. Pryce had begun to make up for a run, as in such a companion he saw no great fun, when a single bright ray shone out on the way he had passed, and he saw, with no little dismay, coming after him bounding o'er crag and o'er rock, the deceased Mrs. Winifred's grandmother's clock. 'Twas so, it had certainly moved from its place, and come lumbering on thus to hold him in chase. 'Twas the very same head, and the very same case, and nothing was altered at all but the face. In that he perceived with no little surprise the two little winder holes turned into eyes, blazing with ire like two coals of fire, and the name of the Maker was changed to a lip, and the hands to a nose with a very red tip. No, he could not mistake it, 'twas she to the life, the identical face of his poor defunct wife. One glance was enough, completely quant suff, as the doctors write down when they send you their stuff. Like a weathercock whirled by a vehement puff, David turned himself round. 10 feet of ground he cleared in his start at the very first bound. I've seen people run at West End Fair for cheeses, I've seen ladies run at Beau Fair for chemises, at Greenwich Fair 20 men run for a hat, and one from a bailiff much faster than that. At football I've seen lads run after the bladder, I've seen Irish bricklayers run up a ladder, I've seen little boys run away from a cane, and I've seen, that is, read of, good running in Spain. But I never did read of or witness such speed as David exerted that evening, indeed. All I have ever heard of boys, women, or men falls far short of Pryce as he ran over Penn. He reaches its brow, he is past it, and now, having once gained the summit and managed to cross it, he rolls down the side with uncommon velocity. But run as he will, or roll down the hill, that bugbear behind him is after him still, and close at his heels, not at all to his liking, the terrible clock keeps on ticking and striking, till exhausted and sore he can't run any more, but falls as he reaches Miss Davis' door, and screams when they rush out alarmed at his knock, " Oh, look at the clock, do look at the clock!" Miss Davis looked up, Miss Davis looked down, she saw nothing there to alarm her, a frown came o'er her white forehead, she said it was horrid, a man should come knocking at that time of night, and give her mamma and herself such a fright, to squall and to bawl about nothing at all. She begged he'd not think of repeating his call, his late wife's disaster by no means had passed her, she'd have him to know she was meat for his master, then regardless alike of his love and his woes, she turned on her heel, and she turned up her nose. Poor David in vain implored to remain, he dared not, he said, cross the mountain again. Why the fair was obdurate, none knows, to be sure it was said she was setting her cap at the curate. Be that as it may, it is certain the sole hole Pryce found to creep into that night was the coal hole. In that shady retreat, with nothing to eat, and with very bruised limbs, and with very sore feet, all night close he kept. I can't say he slept, but he sighed and he sobbed, and he groaned and he wept, lamenting his sins and his 2 broken shins, bewailing his fate with contortions and grins, and her he once thought a complete rara avis, consigning to Satan, viz. Cruel Miss Davis. Mr. David has since had a serious call. He never drinks ale, wine, or spirits at all, and they say he is going to Exeter Hall, to make a grand speech, and to preach, and to teach people that they can't brew their malt liquor too small, that an ancient Welsh poet, one Pindar ap Tudor, was right in proclaiming Ariston men udor, which means the pure element is for man's belliment, and that gin's but a snare of old Nick the deluder. And still on each evening when pleasure fills up, at the old Goat in Boots with metheglin each cup, Mr. Pryce, if he's there, will get into the chair, and make all his quondam associates stare, by calling aloud to the landlady's daughter, ' Patty, bring a cigar, and a glass of spring water.' The dial he constantly watches, and when the long hand's at the 12 and the short at the 10, he gets on his legs, drains his glass to the dregs, takes his hat and great coat off their several pegs, with his president's hammer bestows his last knock, and says solemnly, ' Gentlemen, look at the clock.' End of Section 5.